Right. Good morning, everybody. It's 11 o'clock, so I think we'll make a start if that's all right with everybody. I think looking at the delegate list, I've met most of you before, but for those that I haven't met before, my name's Chris Beaumont. I'm one of the audit partners at Calibrating. We're a 12-partner practice, audit and accountancy, looking after probably about 45 academy trusts for external audit across the northeast and Yorkshire. And then we're looking after about another 25, 30 for internal audit. So our offices are Darlington, Durham and York, and there's about 100 staff over those, which obviously is what we need to sort of look after all those clients. Over the years, we've done a number of seminars which have been prompted by yourselves on various issues and hot topics. So end of last year, we had a look at procurement and how that could sort of run within an academy trust, and a lady came up to actually speak to a number of you about that. And earlier in the year, we did a seminar which was looking at marketing and income generation pre-COVID. So thankfully, we actually got to meet and see all of you at that one. And then obviously internal assurance, internal scrutiny has become a hot topic of late. So that's why we're doing today's webinar. I'm pleased to sort of that David is able to join us later on. And as you'll see from David's credentials when he starts talking, they're fairly significant, shall we say. He's got a lot of expertise within this sector. It's the second time I've done a webinar like this externally live, so hopefully everything will go smoothly. I've done one or two internally. It's always slightly odd talking directly to a computer and having no interaction at all from an audience. So I can't tell if I'm going too fast, too slow, whether I need to spend a bit more time on something or not. So please use the chat box to let us know. We've put the details down there. It's on the right-hand column as you're looking at your screens. If you've got any technical issues, just send those chat to the host, because you can choose who to send it to. And my colleague Ben will sort things out there. And if you've got any questions for David or I, just pick up on our names and send the questions in that way. So I'm going to sort of speak probably for about 15 minutes, just to sort of set the scene, really. And then David will sort of pick up from there and sort of give you a bit more meat on the bones, so to speak, if you excuse the expression. So I'm just going to have a quick look at the development of the role over the last few years. The committees, the operation of those committees, risk register, but just sort of really touching upon that, and looking at what areas you may or may not consider. And then I've got a link to suggested internal scrutiny report which the ESFA have brought out, and then I'll leave you with various sort of reference materials or a list of, so you can sort of follow through to those. So going back, as I was going to say, we've been involved with academies for probably neck end of 20 years since Tony Blair came in, but the responsible officer role came in probably not long after that. And that was really sort of aimed at a sort of trustee or a governor coming in and doing some sort of spot checks. And there was a list at the back of the Academy's financial handbook which told everybody exactly what needed to happen. But as you'll all appreciate, the academy market has changed dramatically over the last few years. And although the number of individual academies, i.e. schools, has increased over the last few years, the number of trusts has actually reduced. And that's because those trusts are getting larger. And therefore, when Lord Agnew was the minister, one of his focuses was actually around internal scrutiny. And what he's done is really sort of moved that role on over the last few years. To the extent now that it's got its own section within the Academy's financial handbook. So part 3, pages 28 to 32, sort of go through in a bit more detail what must and should happen. But increasingly, there is a number of musts coming into the internal scrutiny. Now this year are sort of the 7 of those musts within the internal scrutiny section. So it's an increasing use of the word must. However, saying that, as I think you all probably appreciate, the word must is becoming a more and more prevalent within the Academy's financial handbook as it is. I mean, you've now got part 8 within the Academy's financial handbook, and I think it's got about 90 plus musts for academy trusts, including some sort of sub-bullet points as well on that one. And the other thing, which obviously brought in for the first time last year, was submission of your latest internal scrutiny, internal assurance report to them. And this year is now wanting you to look back over and look at the details for the entire year and come up with a summary report. And I'll mention a bit more about that in a minute. Right, so first thing to sort of consider then is the committee and what that committee should look like. And I think most of this will be fairly familiar to a lot of you. Just over £50 million must have a dedicated audit committee. I'll be perfectly honest, most trusts that we deal with are smaller than that, and therefore have combined that with the finance committee, in part because actually trying to get the people with the skills and expertise to actually be on a number of boards, as in an audit committee and a finance committee, is not always the easiest thing. It talks about the committee should meet 3 times a year. Doesn't say must, it's a should. But then 3.8 about the committee and what it must do is sort of down there, sort of directing the trust programme of work, making sure that basically everything is being tested by internal scrutiny, and then the reports to the board. One of the things I think is usually done, it's done better than the other side, is the financial management risk. It's probably done better than looking at the non-financials, but I'm sure David will have a view on that one in a few minutes on that side. What it says is the employees of the trust should not unsurprisingly be members of a standalone audit committee. What they actually expect is actually the accounting officer and the chief financial officer to attend and provide information. And it talks there about sort of the chair of the trust should not also be a chair of the committee. I think that sort of stands for good governance, that's the sort of the case there. So that's a little bit about the committee. Obviously, if the committee is set up, then what we need next is sort of some terms of reference, and I've got some a link on the next page to the SFA's wording on that one. What it's looking at is that committee should sort of obviously agree an internal scrutiny programme which looks at what needs to be done across the year. And it does talk about across the year rather than just, as 1 or 2 people have done over the past, have had one visit, say in a January, and then no further visits until sort of the year-end external audit comes along in the sort of the October, November time. And that's really not across the year. That's really sort of looking at it once during the course of the year. It's talking about them reviewing the rating and response to the risk register, and I'll come on a bit more to talk about that in a minute. And then it talks about monitoring the progress and addressing those recommendations. And that's very important, that actually talk about these reports being done, but actually this committee must actually sort of look at them, and then if there are action points that are in them, actually make sure they are actioned. And that applies equally to whether it's the internal audit or internal scrutiny that takes place during the year, or the external audit at the year end. And we've seen some very good examples over the years whereby in our first year of audit, we've come up with a number of issues, and the committee has actually then sort of taken those away and looked at them in a lot of detail and actually monitored them throughout the year to make sure that by the time we get round to next year's audit, those issues are all dealt with. And then sort of moving on, the operation of the committee, it talks here about sort of various musts, and these are all musts per the Academy Financial Handbook. So it must sort of consider other sources of assurance, and that's something, again, I don't think always comes to the fore when that committee is actually meeting. They probably look at the internal scrutiny report, which has been done by people like ourselves, but they possibly don't always look at some of the other reports which actually are available. So you've got sort of governance review may well have been taking place. Should the sort of the scrutiny committee have a look at that? Well, yes. Are there sort of funding audits that have been taking place during the year, sort of an Annex G, TCAF or something like that sort of taking place? And yes, obviously that gives the that committee some assurance that actually the funding is actually being sort of used appropriately, and also in some cases being claimed appropriately as well. Hopefully you don't get into a situation whereby you've got ESFA investigations going on, but if you do, hopefully that's on the risk register. And then effectively, if they've given you a report and you've looked at their findings, then you can actually then sort of make sure that committee monitors and follows them up. I imagine if you've got an ESFA financial management review, it's not just the audit committee that will be interested in that one, but everybody within the trust. And it talks as well within it about sort of the fact that this work that's actually undertaken, sort of the work that the committee undertakes, should look at all the academies within the trust. So not just sort of Academy A or B during the course of the year, but actually look at them all throughout the course of the time period that you've actually decided on. And it also talks about a annual summary report, which is what I'll come on to in a few moments. the annual summary report, just really sort of for the SFA, but also for the board, so they can actually sort of see what work has been done by this committee. I should have said earlier on that actually anybody is available or can actually go along to an audit committee meeting. It doesn't have to necessarily be those which have been appointed to that committee. Anybody is eligible to go along to their trustees. It's just you don't always get that many people taking that advantage of that up. If anybody does want to have a look and just sort of check that their wording is correct for their sort of the policies and procedures they've got in place around internal scrutiny, the SFA in October updated the internal scrutiny academy trusts document, and in Annex 1 it's got some good examples of actually what should be there, or what they consider good examples of what should be included. So you've got your audit committee, that's all set up. It's got its terms of reference, it knows what it's going to be doing. Then we sort of need to really sort of make sure we've got this risk register in place. And again, a risk register now is a must for the Academy's financial handbook. I must admit, I'm not aware of any trusts that haven't got a risk register, but everybody must have a risk register put in place. These are just some examples on here. NGA, the National Governance Association, I do know have a longer list on their website. So if anybody's not a member of that, it may well be worthwhile sort of joining that and having a look at the list of things which they think should be considered on the risk register. What I would say is, in my view, the risk register shouldn't be just done at the trust level, but actually should be done at the schools level, and the individual schools should be having a look at their risks. And it may well be that you're actually coming up with a list of sort of 20 or 30 items, possibly more at a school level. But then somebody should be actually pulling all of those trust registers together to also come up with a trust register, which may well have then a sort of a top 10 or 12 or 15 items. And that work around sort of the risk registers should actually, in my opinion, be pulled together by the sort of the executive, and then it's there for challenge by those trustees and directors. And what they'll be looking at there is, you've got that as a risk, but what about A, B, or C? Why is that not on there? And sort of they should be challenging for that. They should also be challenging on, you think something is a low risk because of A, B, or C. Well, is that actually true? And is that sort of appropriate? So the trustees and directors should offer a fair degree of challenge around this risk register to make sure that the things are on there and are on there at the right sort of risk level, if you like. Some of the things which I'm sure you all consider around economic and funding, national funding formula, at what point will various grants, pension and teachers' pay get subsumed into that, and how will that impact going forward? We obviously had the teachers' pay grant major increase in September last year. Was that on people's risk register? Is a similar thing going to happen with the local government pension scheme one, given the way that the local government pension scheme valuations are coming out at the moment? Possibly, possibly not, because the valuation for what the employer contributions pay is done on a different basis to the valuations that are included in the year-end accounts. Are you looking at pupil demographics? I mean, there's a bulge coming through Darlington, which is where I'm based, and that's therefore had an impact on the sort of the local primary schools now feeding through into the secondary schools. Is there a free school opening up nearby? Is there an independent school becoming a free school? All of those things will have sort of impacts on the organisation. And if you're suddenly down by 30 pupils in a year group, as you'll appreciate, that's £150,000 a year while that year group goes through. So you could be talking after 5 years, sort of £750,000 worth of monies here that actually the Academy doesn't receive because it's not been watching to make sure that these things are actually taken into account. I put down there legal transport. I mean, a lot of people know about the disability bus access that caused a lot of problems earlier in the year. But again, that was one that's been highlighted for a number of years and seems to have gone off people's radar, including the bus companies, or most noticeably the bus companies, and then it's come back to bite a few people. And then things like staffing, recruitment, retention, illness, or even potentially actually doing too well at staff retention, and actually you'd like one or two to move on to actually get some sort of newly qualifieds in there to actually try and balance up the budget. And obviously, last but not least on there is things like trustee recruitment and making sure you've got the right people. So that's the sort of first stage with that risk register, just trying to make sure that you've obviously identified everything. And then David will go into a bit more detail on this, but then looking at what those risks are, the likelihood, probability of them occurring, before then sort of scoring them somehow or other, be that percentage or value or some sort of matrix. But there's a number of different ways of doing that, and then David will have some views on that. And then management or control of risks. What sort of systems and controls are actually in there at the moment? And that's really what you want us, when we come in as doing the internal scrutiny role, to do, is actually check that those controls are actually working. If you think you've got a high risk area, but actually you've got these controls in which actually make it a low risk, well, actually those controls aren't working, or for whatever reason aren't relevant, then that can have a fairly significant impact on the organisation going forward. And I've noticed at the end of David's slide deck, he's got some horror stories in there of things that have gone wrong. So it'll just give you an idea about those things, and also make sure what those controls that you have got in place are relevant. I mean, you could, if you wanted to make sure that no monies was spent unintendedly, or on sort of things that you wouldn't sort of want the trust to spend monies on, or to keep budgets very much controlled. You could, as a daft example, set effectively a limit of, say, £100, whereby the accounting officer and the chief financial officer have to sign off on every single purchase invoice that actually goes through. Well, that would be, I would suggest, a slight overkill. Now, where that is, it obviously needs to be set within your delegation of authority. But at the other end of the extreme, it probably doesn't want to be that they're not involved until you get up to £50,000, £100,000. So looking at those controls and making sure they're realistic and appropriate is very, very, very important. And then it's got on there monitoring and reporting. On one size does not fit all. I'm going to do a quick poll. Never done one of these before, so we're going to see how it works. But I think the time that comes up, it says you've got 5 minutes to do this poll. I'll be perfectly honest, we haven't got 5 minutes to do this poll. If people can sort of respond within sort of a minute or something, then that would be great. Because I'm conscious I'm possibly running slightly into David's time if I don't speed up slightly here. So if people can come back and sort of let us know what internal scrutiny work they've had done. Have they had it done on sort of census data, one-off revenue grants, capital grants in the last year, or is it something they're intending on doing in the next year? So it's just, is that something that's actually built into your program? Is it something you're thinking about doing as internal scrutiny work on these areas? It looks like most of you sort of, I think, well, for most of you haven't done that much about it looking at this. But if I move swiftly onto the sort of the next slide, what you'll see is that something sort of came in very much under the radar last year. And this is really sort of talking about, sorry, it's on slide too far. And this is talking about here about what came in the Calibrating Financial Handbook. And this was actually the 2019 handbook, but I must admit, a lot of people sort of missed it. And I know Mark, one of my colleagues who leads our internal assurance, internal scrutiny work, will be speaking to our clients going forward to make sure this is covered off if appropriate. But what came in within the Calibrating Financial Handbook 2019 was that you must sort of consider sort of really those sort of numbers that might have an impact on funding. So whether that's sort of the pupil numbers return, i.e. census data, how is that being reviewed to make sure that sort of there aren't errors creeping in there, because obviously your census return obviously impacts on what funding you receive, what revenue funding claims you've actually got during the course of the year. Have you done those LXGs that I mentioned earlier? Have you looked at the pupil premium? Have you made sure that's appropriate? And then sort of capital grants and conditional improvement fund. Has anybody sort of looked at that and actually made sure that the monies that came in have been spent appropriately and actually everything's been sort of accounted for on that basis? But I'd say that's something that came in sort of last year, very much under the radar and wasn't sort of really highlighted by the department. But this is a list which is actually included now within the ESFA's internal scrutiny good guidance in Appendix 2. It's not an exhaustive list, and they actually note it's not an exhaustive list themselves. But as you'll appreciate in there, what it does pick up on is things that we have looked at historically, and actually things that actually will be common with the RO role if we go back a number of years. Your cash at bank, procurement, your financial close down. But then it's also getting into data and IT issues, premises issues, governance structure, business continuity plans, disaster recovery. So they are sort of widening the net of actually what they think that committee should be looking at, and actually what you should be thinking about in respect to the of that internal scrutiny and how it's actually dealt with on a year-by-year basis and how it's monitored. Is that an exhaustive list? Again, I'm sure that David will consider that an inadequate list at this moment in time, and we'll be thinking that there's a lot more that should be added to that. And I think a lot more will be added to that in due course. I think this is really a sort of starter for 10. It all depends on whether the new minister picks up where Lord Agnew left off and actually continues to sort of increase this internal scrutiny, potentially to the level where the colleges are at, because a number of multi-academy trusts out there are larger than the colleges which are out there, and the amount of work they do around internal scrutiny is significantly more in a lot of cases than that done by multi-academy trusts at this moment in time. Just put that slide up there, conscious of time. The ESFA, as you can sort of see at the bottom there again within that ESFA's internal scrutiny guide, have come up with an annual report. I know Mark's working with a number of you to actually come up with a summary document ourselves. One reminder, it should be one summary per trust, not one per school within the trust. So how can we help? Not unsurprisingly, we've developed a number of programs. These were all in sort of 12 months ago, and a number of those sort of cover off or are identical almost to the list which I've just shown you from the ESFA, which they've now released. We have sort of separated out some like HR and staffing separate from payroll, but otherwise those programs are sort of cover similar areas. We've got additional ones on things like vehicles, capital and contract management, and taxation. And there'll be some things within the ESFA one that we as external advisors can't sort of advise on, because it's things like estates management, making sure that sort of health and safety is sort of done appropriately. That's things that we can't get involved in, but obviously you do get other reports during the course of the year, and they should feed again into the internal scrutiny. So those are some of the references I've sort of pulled up during my short presentation, slightly longer than intended by a few minutes. Those are my contact details in the middle, but most of you will have those. And on that basis, I'll pass across to David. If anybody has any queries or questions, then please use the chat function to let us know. So thank you for now, and I'll pass across to David.
Thank you, Chris. I know we've got one question coming in already, so we will be no doubt picking up on that in a short while. The discussion really, I'm hopefully going to follow on from Chris's sort of expose of risk management in the trust sector, and looking really at the link between the legal implications and risk management and how it works in practice and how it can be made to work better. But also, I think quite interesting, people love to know when it breaks, what it looks like. And from those elements where risk management fails, what lessons can we learn? And hopefully we'll pick up on a few of those which are relevant to your environment. So moving on, a little bit about myself. I run a small risk consultancy based in York. My accountants happen to be Clive Owen, strangely enough. But I've been involved in risk management for I was going to say years, but I suppose I really ought to say decades. And being very closely involved in a number of initiatives around risk management on understanding how we learn lessons from things failing, including one of the recent rather tragic reports we undertook with the Institute of Civil Engineers on the lessons learned from Grenfell. And that we'll talk about some of the lessons like we've drawn from instances like that a little bit later on. Also been involved in providing sort of contributing to the production of some of the documents we refer to a little bit later on. And I think my one moment in the sun was providing evidence to Jacob Rees-Mogg and others at the Select Committee on the Restoration and Refurbishment on the Palaces of Westminster, which was quite an experience. My basic message at the time was, staying in a building whilst you're doing refurbishment is risky. You better bugger off out of there. So after 20 or 30 minutes question and answer, I think that was the one message I was able to get across. Unfortunately, they have taken heed of that, and when they come to restoration refurbishment of a major project like the Palaces of Westminster, they are finding themselves a new home, and at one point discussed York, although I think that was a little bit of a flying a kite. Anyway, a little bit about what we should get out today. Purpose today is to support you meet your legal obligations, identify the systems and processes that you can put in place if you haven't got in place, or how you can improve those processes you already have, identify the common failure modes. And then ultimately, the key point here is better enabling people to communicate about risk, understand what we mean when we talk about risk. And I think this is one of the key problems. So my background included what's called market risk in the financial sector. Market risk is very much a application of the mathematics into a financial environment. And when we talk about risk in the financial markets, we talk about risk as uncertainty. And that's one of the themes which we'll be following through over the next few slides. And to start that off, I've prepared a small Q&A, which we will pick up on in a moment. But the issue really that we need to focus on is when we describe and quantify risk, we need to give risk a number in some way. And people's understanding of numbers differs. And it's the way we describe the numbers and the numbers we apply to that which influence how that message is communicated. So when we talk about something being a high risk or a medium risk, ultimately there's some proxy of how likely is it to happen and how big is the impact if it does happen. And there's a bringing of those two together and sort of working out what the risk is on the basis of those two elements together. So to start that off, I'm got a quiz or a small question, just talking about a scenario where we've got a town served by 2 hospitals, and in the large hospital in the town, on average 45 babies are born a day, and in the smaller one 15 babies are born a day. So knowing that this is important to the mathematics here, you can't have you can't have a boy which is half a child which is half boy half girl. So 50% on average are girls and 50% are boys. Unless, like me, you end up with 3 daughters, and that seems to change the odds against you somehow when you get home. Sometimes, though, there may be more than 50% and sometimes lower. And so when you actually start thinking about the implications of that, and this sort of random example of how you would decide how much ward space to paint pink or blue, you need to sort of start quantifying that difference for the large hospital and the small hospital. So if we consider a period of 12 months, 1 year, in each hospital, and record the days on which over 60% of the babies were born were boys, what we want to do now is establish which of the hospitals, the smaller hospital or the larger hospital, will have a larger number of days where boys are born on them, or 60%. So we need to think about the mental process you're going through in addressing that question. So you need to give some thought to what are you trying to calculate here. So Ben, if we can put the quiz up now, please. And again, like Chris, this probably says 5 minutes. So the question is, which hospital do you think recorded more such days, i.e. more days where 60% or more boys were born? No? Here we go. Oh, right, brilliant. So, firstly, the larger hospitals, 1 out of 26. 8 have got the smaller hospital, and we'll look at that in a moment, and that's quite interesting. And the largest proportion are saying about the same. Okay, so if I take back control, please, Ben, just to allow us to move on. So, the answer is the smaller hospital. And when we get, here we go. So it's 2.5 times, or more than 2.5 times more likely that the smaller hospital will have more than 60 boys born on any day. Now, how do we get to that? Well, we get to that by looking at the number of days that 9 or more boys out of 15, i.e. 60%, are born. So if you look at the chart in red, we've highlighted the number of days, or the proportion of the number of days where 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, or 15 boys out of the 15 in the smaller hospital are born. And we can see that works out at a probability of about 30%. Now, for the larger hospital, you've got many more sort of possible outcomes. So the way the numbers get distributed between the possible outcomes, and recognizing that you can't have a 50% a part boy, you have either whole numbers here. You're going from 27 upwards represents your 60% or greater. And that gives you a figure of 11.6%. So you've got this ratio of about 2.6 times the number of boys proportionately being born in the smaller hospital than the larger hospital. Now, assuming this wasn't a 50-50 split, and there was something in the understanding of the likelihood which wasn't symmetrical like that, or the numbers were infinitely greater than the 45 babies a day that we see in the larger hospital, say we're up to 100 or 1,000 events, or in terms of pupils catching for example, pupils becoming infected through a virus as a random example, and we say it's about 1%. How do you start learning and understanding what steps you should be taking? So when we sort of disaggregate that and look at this, break this down, the steps that we take in analysing this is classic sort of Bayesian analysis, looking at each step, what happens at each stage in the operation. So in the first step, there's a 50-50 chance that on what the first boy, a 50-50 chance the second child is a boy, and that follows through multiple times. So in the first chart, the smaller hospital, you run this through 15 times. And on the second chart, you run it through 45 times. And in the simple example where you've just got two iterations, i.e. 2 children, then the chance is 50-50 that you get equal numbers of boys and girls. You've got boy, 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 girl, girl, boy, and girl, girl. So those are the 4 options. Now, A-level maths, bit of application of statistics here. So that's the mathematical analysis that sits behind that outcome, that sort of ratio of 2.6. The 2.6 is something you can do something with, but in order to get to that number in a reliable way, rather than just sort of guessing, it's often necessary to actually apply a bit of an analytic skill. So, whilst it's possible in the example to sort of, we see a number of people in the test, we've got 8 out of the 26, getting the smaller hospital right. But when we really want to understand and quantify the risk, the relative difference needs some analysis behind it. And often that process itself, that dynamic process of thinking about how the risk is shaping up in terms of likelihoods and impacts, gives a hell of a lot of understanding and a lot of insight in how best to manage that risk. So, the risk universe. Running a academic trust is a bit like running a space station, I suppose. You're going to be confronted with risks coming from a number of different angles. And there are 4 broad categories in terms of risk. You've got the external, factors outside your control. These are things such as the coronavirus, such as terrorism is one. We've also got the external economic crises that are taking place. We have the more familiar internal areas, which I think Chris has already highlighted a number of those. Often we create projects, and those projects are put in place in some regards to address underlying risks that a academic trust or an organisation is facing in terms of in terms of ICT changes or such likes. And then the final one is the broader strategic risk, which is those decisions made by the trustees and the governing bodies on what direction of travel the trust is going in. And I use the International Space Station, as an example, not just because it's in the news at the moment with the latest taxi service making deliveries this week, but also because when NASA are doing their original analysis over this, they demonstrated through quite a lot of detailed analysis on a heat map the impact from external events hitting the International Space Station. And I think it's a very strong analogy to think about your organization in this way. So coming in from one side, you have all these external risks which are going to hit your business, and you need then to shield your business, as they've done with the International Space Station. They've done the analysis and they said the red bits need to be shielded more than the blue bits because we're more likely to be hit, and the impact of if we are hit is going to be more devastating on those areas than on the solar panels here, for example, which are just grayed out because actually they can afford to have 1 centimetre blocks going through those. But if we consider the impact of internal risks and strategic risks and project risks all coming at you from different directions, it's quite a good visualization of what is risk management about. It's understanding how you need to shield and manage your organization, how you need to manage the Academy Trust to deal with the known risks that the organization is facing. So some basic risk principles. All these approaches, the risk principles, the structuring of the internal and external risks, the strategic risks and project risks, based on UK government guidance. And UK government do some really good stuff in terms of helping organisations think about risk management. But one of the main drivers behind that is the early adoption many years ago of the international standard ISO 31000 on risk management. And government principles are drawn from that, and government risk management methodologies derive from that. But at its heart, the view is that risk is an integral part of how you organise yourselves, how you govern your organisation, and it exists at many levels within the Academy Trusts, within the organisation. And I was very pleased when Chris said it should be considered at school level and individual sort of functions within large academies as well. So there's a number of ways of considering and thinking about risk, but fundamentally it should be cascaded through and exist throughout the organisation. A risk principle which is very dear to my heart is very often I find when talking to organisations when something's gone wrong, there was some information, some insight, some knowledge, some collective expertise that existed within that organisation which could have managed that risk better if it had been shared and disseminated through a risk management process. And to me, it's unforgivable that organisations have failures when there are people who are saying, this is a risk, we need to deal with it, and that is not being acted on. And we'll talk about the reporting process a little bit later on, but this is critical in terms of a risk principle, that there's this flow of information through the organisation in terms of clear, uninhibited communication to the people who need to know. So the ISO 31000 methodology, it says set out your risk principles, establish a coherent framework, implement an effective process, and these processes, these principles, this framework can easily recognise and incorporate the obligations, which we'll touch on in a moment. I think the COVID-19 situation has clearly shown that good risk management is integral to keeping trust and building that sort of relationship with your stakeholders. So it's not just purely dealing with the department, but it's also dealing with your pupils and with the staff and many other parties who are affected by how well each Academy Trust is being managed. If you get it wrong, and we'll see in some of the cases later on, you can end up in some very hot water. It's very easy for miscalculations on risk, and I'm interested in some of the conversations that are taking place at the moment. David Spiegelhalter, who's one of the experts who've been contributing to SAGE's discussions, came and talked to our risk group, what I was chairing, and he's a very impressive character. But what he was really bringing to the table was saying that at the heart of risk management is the clarity of explaining about uncertainty, being open and honest about things you don't know. So the risk framework, and I'm going to go through these next few slides quite quickly because there's quite a bit to go through, but the risk framework is defined based on the principles leading to a mandate and commitment. Catch it up with my mouse click, we can go through this more quickly. And develops a framework within which we can manage the risks. And the overall implementation of that mismanagement sits within that framework. The principles are that we take a proactive approach. We continually look at the improvements to that process. Included within the risk framework, we've got the contingency planning that we've talked about already. But it also allows you to think about the areas of your performance which are easily achievable and those which are less easily achievable. And from that, you're able to set targets which are meaningful and effective. The nub and the heart of risk process is a communication and consultation framework within which the risks are identified, they're assessed, they're analysed, and we talk about the analysis in terms of likelihood and consequence in a moment. That bringing together of those elements allows you to evaluate and compare the risks and prioritise and determine what action to take. There's a number of links through my slides, which I believe there'll be, Chris, I think you're sharing the slides later. Is that correct? Yes, you are. That's great. So the links are there in the same way. So coming back to the drivers, the Academy Trust faces a number of legal obligations. The broad FRC guidance on risk management and internal controls for boards, which state that the nature and the extent of the principal risks you're willing to take in achieving your strategic objectives. What are they and how are you managing those risks? You have your sound risk management internal control systems. All these we've talked about with Chris earlier. And there's more specific things about the Academy's financial handbook, which we'll talk about in a little while. I was interested and rather perturbed by some of the recommendations in there when it comes to risk management. The broader context, so picking up on the non-financial and the wider environment in which risks take place, there's a wider obligation on all organisations to exercise reasonable care. And that implies that you consider and give thought of the potential risks that your organisation faces, both those it poses to the people it employs, to its existence as an organisation, and also to its wider stakeholders. There's the employer's liability, there's the wider health and safety questions, and of course, there's the corporate governance obligations, which are comply or explain. So your risk management process needs to incorporate all those things, which include well, if you don't comply, explain why. It's not that you don't do certain things, but you need to explain your process and your thought behind it. So the number of rules and regulations have gone up over time and is constantly changing. So you need a process to deal with the legal and regulatory compliance. In the energy sector, which I work closely with, this is a dominant feature in the performance of all large energy companies. And in order to deal with that, we build a compliance register. And I'm thinking and talking to Chris previously, I think this is something which, if you don't have already, it's something that should be given serious consideration of. So taking a compliance register within which you capture all the applicable legislation and contract and you keep it up to date and you monitor it. You then map those obligations to individual parts of the organisation, to who's responsible for your facilities, how are they managing the risks and the obligations in terms of their legal requirements. Create an action clause, identify which bit need act. Chris picked out the word must, and it's that process of picking out all those musts and shalls and putting those into a simple framework. And then this is the clever bit with this, is then you take each one of those musts and you disaggregate those musts into detailed binary questions where you end up with a simple, have you done this, haven't you done this? And then you follow that tiered process through and you allocate those questions to the responsible functions, the frontline team. And this leads into an annual and periodic review process, which allows you then essentially to put in place a controlled self-assessment. So your core team can then implicitly learn from the front line. They can demonstrate that the appropriate controls have been put in place. Those controls then can be reviewed and audited by sampling or by exception. So this is a very strong and very powerful framework which allows your legal and compliance risks to be drawn together and pinned down in one place. So next couple of slides we'll be talking about articulating and describing risk. We'll be talking about defining and populating the risk registers and likelihood and consequence. And I think risk is, Chris has given you a bit of a heads up on this already. One of the main issues with risk management is how you describe the word and what you understand by the word risk. When we talk about risk management, what we're talking about is both the causes, the events, and the consequences, and we think of them together. And a good way of visualizing that is to think of it as a bow tie, where the event is at the core, and either side of that you've got the causes and the consequences, and there can be multiple causes and there can be multiple consequences from any one event. This provides a methodology for how you should be talking and describing risks, and I think it's helpful. These slides are in orange because this was pinched from the orange book, where there's a number of other examples, and this gives you an idea of what this means in practice. So a failure to manage departmental budgets could be triggered by a poor financial culture, could result in an overspend or funding pressure. So these are methodologies of describing the risk. But what we need to think about very importantly then here is when we talk about consequences, given the focus from an accountant's perspective is broadly going to be on the overspend, funding pressure, and all those costings, how do we link those and how do we bring into one framework all those other risks that are faced by complex, multifaceted organisations such as academy trusts? So firstly, you've got to think about consequences, and you think about when you talk about impacts and consequences, what are those and how are you categorising those? Is it possible to define the life of a person or the harm to an individual in a financial measurement? I mean, this is an area which is very uncomfortable, where nobody likes to get into, but implicitly within a risk framework, you're making these sorts of judgments. You know, is a coverage in the local press of, 3 or 4 weeks, how do you rate that in terms of a comparable financial risk? So you need some methods of actually calibrating and counting each of those risks. And we'll talk about likelihood a little bit, but not as much. We'll concentrate, I think, on the consequences side. But all these are drawn together in your risk register. And one point about a risk register is that each risk that you put in there is a model of that risk. It's not the real risk. And we know all models are wrong. So this is an approximation. It's a proxy for what it's saying. But it does allow you, if you get your metrics right, get your consequence measurements right, your likelihoods comparably drawn up, it allows comparison to be made, and then you can prioritize what actions you need to take. And risk reporting isn't a one-off. This is often how it's applied and interpreted in practice is get my report out at the end of the month, or get it out at the end of the quarter, or get it out at the end of the year. But risk reporting is an active process. It's a means to an end. It should be integral to the management thinking and how you operate on a day-to-day basis. So quantifying and calibrating risk. Key points here is when you talk about likelihood, you need to be more specific in determining what you mean by the words medium or low or high. The government guidance provides this framework. I would just urge some caution in how if you were to apply a very high likelihood, something as almost certain to occur, that perhaps a better way to think about this would be if something's almost certain to occur, i.e. over 50% likely, then perhaps you should be redoing your budgets and replanning your targets and objectives as an organisation and resetting, because if anything's more likely than not to occur, then you should be building your plans around that rather than leaving it on a risk register saying, well, it's on the risk register, it's 90% likely to occur, but we haven't adjusted our budgets for it. For the meat of this, and I've got a couple of minutes, so I'm going to spend a bit of time on this and then jump on to some of the risk failures. When talking about consequences and impact, there are a number of different dimensions or axes, as I called them previously, in which you can measure this. And this is a typical framework that is applied in commercial organisations and public sector organisations, where you have financial metrics, where you can measure from your low impact to your high impact against budget. So you may put 5% as your high risk sort of threshold, and you may leave anything within plus or minus 1% as within tolerance. But you need equally to have similar descriptions and similar definitions for your other risks. And this needs to be part of the management. The trustees need to be involved in setting and determining this so that there's common language used when describing a high risk and a high impact event. Example here, reputation, loss of public confidence to some adverse local media. Working with a large energy company, we literally used to measure the number of column inches in the local and national press and scale it on there in terms of how big an impact and at what point did we escalate that for board discussion. And it was down to a physical measure of in printed media days of how many inches of adverse coverage were we getting in national press, how many inches of adverse coverage were we getting in local press. Major disasters that we've seen. We've had the economic crisis in 2008. We've had the Challenger disaster in 1986. I'll pick up on this one and one other. The Challenger disaster in 1986 was due to trying to squeeze 24 launches into a year, a failure of communication between the manufacturers of the booster rockets and their concerns about the performance of these rubber seals in cold weather, and the launch team who were really keen to get launches away. And when they did the report that looked into the Challenger disaster, one of the key findings was that the two teams involved in this particular incidents were talking about risk and having a different conversation to each other. So when one party was saying there is a 1 in 100 chance of a major flaw or fatal flaw on launch, others were interpreting that as a 1 in 100,000. There's a massive difference in how this risk was being communicated. And given that they were on like 50 or 60 launches at the time, there was one group saying it is almost inevitable there will be a major and fatal flaw here, and the other party were not hearing that message. So when we talk about risk, understanding how you describe risk and how you communicate risk is absolutely crucial. One of the key messages from today, which we're trying to squeeze into 20 minutes, which failed miserably, the first bit of risk management here. Creating a positive risk environment depends on four key things. The first really is understanding the difference between accountability and blame. There's an interesting sort of expression that there are some risks you just can't, that are part of your organization's business model. You can't get rid of it. In regard to understanding what you can do about it, accountability and blame are very important and vital, different characteristics. There are some things where people can be accountable for, and there are some things which nobody can be, no blame can be attributed to an individual. So you can't eliminate some risks, and you need to know how you're managing those risks and learn to live and manage that. Rather than the process, understanding and talking about risk and communicating that there is uncertainty in our day-to-day existence, and then how we're addressing those risks on a day-to-day basis is crucially important, that people talk and follow the same messages. In risk, don't forget that some risks have a compounding effect on other risks. So in isolation, coronavirus has a very specific effect, but there are many other challenges that have arisen from that in terms of supply chain, in terms of third parties being unable to deliver goods and services to time. And then final point today really would be different perspectives, and there's a couple of slides in here talking about this. One of the key areas in terms of risk management is that we often come at it with our own biases and our own perspectives. Having an alternative perspective, an alternative view, be it referring to Clive Owen and looking for their insight and their sort of ideas to challenge your thinking, I think it's really a powerful part of a good, robust risk management framework, is drawing in sort of critical friends, using 4 eyes principles, applying sort of reverse sort of psychology in terms of how could things go wrong. So I think we'll end on that point, Chris, conscious it's 12. There was another question quiz there, but.
No, thank you very much, David. I think that's been very insightful. I appreciate there's a fair few slides to get through there in 20 minutes or so. So thank you very much for getting through them as quickly as you could while giving everybody an idea. I mean, I presume if anybody's got any questions after this, David, that you'd be quite open to sort of having discussions via email or phone if necessary with people. And if people wanted some help with risk registers, then obviously that's something you'd be able to sort of potentially do on a consultancy basis with those organisations.
No, absolutely. I mean, hopefully there's a lot more in the slides. Again, we are in 20 minutes is probably too much to try to squeeze in there. There's a feedback loop there for us to follow, for me to follow on. So, but thank you anyway.
Thank you for that, David. We've got one other question in there, which is about the if we have a combined finance and audit committee, does the 3 non-employee trustee rule stand, or can we have 2 non-employee trustees and the CEO, who is also a trustee? I mean, what the guidance says at the moment is the employees of the trust should not be committee members. It doesn't say must not, it says should not. I mean, obviously it would be good practice if you could get 3 non-employee trustees, but at the moment, the way that the Academy's financial handbook's actually drawn up, there's no problem at the moment with having 2 non-employee trustees and the CEO as it's set out. But I'll say, I think good governance would be the fact of you should move if you can towards 3. But if that's where you're at the moment, you're not in breach of the Academy's financial handbook as it stands. Conscious that we've had at least one response saying that they haven't received the slides. They should have gone out at the beginning, so apologies if you didn't receive the slides. We are going to sort of send them out again just to make sure that you have got them. We'll try and include David's contact details within there. So if anybody's got any sort of questions for David or for myself that they want to follow up offline rather than sort of within this environment, then we can do so, because as David said, we've run out of time, unfortunately, today. So thank you very much for attending on that one. If anybody, as I say, has any thoughts about any other sort of seminars they'd like going forward, or whether they'd like us to rerun this but looking at things in a bit more detail, then please do get in touch with us, and we'll have a look and see what we can facilitate in respect of future webinars. We are looking at one on VAT for academies at the moment, which will be in the new year sometime. But I'm sure if David is asked, he'll be able to sort of provide a few more details if people want to home in on certain aspects of risk register or how to sort of pull certain things together. Then, as I say, please let us know, and we'll be able to do something in the future. Otherwise, David, I think you can think of anything else. I think it's probably time to sign off. No, thank you, Chris. And yeah, as Chris saying, any questions, get in touch. Right. Thank you all for participating today. I think we only lost one person during the entire seminar, so that was good, especially when it's a reasonably dry subject, but it's a very important one that we all must sort of take some lessons from and make sure is put in place appropriately at our organisations. So thank you very much for your time, and look forward to speaking to people, hopefully in person in due course. Thank you very much for today. Thank you, Chris.